We will continue tonight with the journeys of Paul, noting the people, places, events, and teachings. And I'm going to kind of summarize that toward the end of this. Now let's see where we left off. Paul had come to Philippi, and there he was falsely accused and beaten and thrust into the inner prison. This is Acts 16:24. I want you to look at that word, thrust into the inner prison and made their feet fast in stocks. That's Paul and Silas. What do you think of when you think of thrust? Well, I can just see that jailer, them bringing them to him, and him just kind of pushing them in there, just kind of casting them there where they just kind of stumbled into that inner prison, and then very cruelly putting their feet in stocks. Paul had been beaten. He had sores. He was unwashed with those sores and very uncomfortable in that inner prison. Think how dark it must have been. They didn't have electric lights, probably no candle, dark, dreary in this inner prison. Some of the commentaries, I don't know if it was rat infested, but they would say so, but it wouldn't have been very sanitary, would it? What a terrible ordeal that those two men went through in Philippi. And yet, in 1 Thessalonians 2 and verse 2, he's going to make reference to this when he said, we suffered before and were shamefully entreated at Philippi, as you know, writing to those in Thessalonica. So, in verse 25 is where we'll begin. At midnight, Paul and Silas prayed and sang praises unto God. There's just a different way that we face the hardships of life, isn't it? Our perspective is so different than that of the world. I don't know how long they suffered, or they're men of like passion like we are. Surely troubles and problems and emotions went through their mind, but by midnight, Paul and Silas had encouraged one another. One of them probably said, let's pray. Let's say a prayer. And after praying together, they're saying, let's sing one of those songs. And they're encouraging each other at midnight in this inner prison. And then it says, the prisoners heard them. Can you hear them? How that must have sounded. I bet it wasn't loud, joyful singing, probably kind of low-key and singing softly to themselves. How that would have sounded coming out of that inner prison and the other prisoners hearing this. What must they have thought about what was occurring? Well, there was an earthquake suddenly, unexpectedly now. There's a great earthquake. The foundations of the prison were shaken, and immediately the doors were opened and everyone's bands were loosed. I don't know how an earthquake could have done that. I can understand the foundations being shaken and maybe rattling the doors so that what prison doors there were, they just swung open. But their bands were loosed. How were they bound? With chains? And somehow those chains fell off of them. I'm reminded of Peter when he was in Jerusalem and the angel appeared and those chains just fell off of him. And so the prisoners are now not bound anymore and the doors are open. So the keeper of the prison awaked out of his sleep, probably the earthquake. Wake him up. You ever been in an earthquake that woke you up in the night? I've heard stories of it. I've been in a few earthquakes, but they were so gentle and tremor. I think I was driving one time and never knew it even occurred because you're a little rattling, and it's just very gentle. But a strong earthquake, something that would be of this magnitude, would wake you up in the night, and it'd be frightening, wouldn't it? Well, the keeper of the prison wakes up during this earthquake, and he sees the prison doors are open. Well, he drew out his sword and would have killed himself, supposing the prisoners had been fled. You remember what Herod did? When they went to take Peter from the prison, and they went and said, he's not there. Herod had the keepers of that prison put to death. That's how responsible you were for the prisoners. If your prisoner escaped, you suffered the fate of your prisoner. And this Roman guard was not going to do that. We think of suicide as a very awful thing. Well, it is an awful thing. We need to think it awful. The Romans thought suicide was an honorable thing, to take your own life. And so he was going to take his own life instead of suffering the indignities of what would happen with him for his prisoners to escape. But Paul cried with a loud voice, saying, "Do yourself no harm. We're all here." Paul evidently seeing out those doors or understanding what that keeper, maybe he said something. He understood what was going on from that inner prison. Don't do that. We're all here. And then he called for a light, and he sprang in. It's one thing to be thrust in, isn't it? And now that keeper that had thrust them in, he sprang in. That sounds like almost like he jumped in. And when he got there, instead of being cruel to these prisoners, what's he doing? He came in trembling and fell down before Paul and Silas. And he brought them out and said, "Sirs, what must I do to be saved?" What's he talking about? Well, it could be his life. I'm in a mess here. The prisoners, what am I going to do to save myself from this dilemma that I'm in? It could have been, he's talking about being saved physically. But he could have been talking about being saved spiritually. You remember what the damsel had been saying that resulted in Paul and Silas being thrown in prison? It's Acts 16 and verse 17. "These men are the servants of the Most High God, which show us the way of salvation." I bet the prisoner had heard why these men were in prison. He may have been seeking spiritual salvation here instead of his fleshly salvation. But regardless of what he was thinking, the Apostle Paul knew how to respond. He's going to respond spiritually. He said, "Believe on the Lord Jesus Christ, and thou shalt be saved in thy house." Now, I want you to watch his house here. It's not just the jailer. It's those of his house. That would include his family. That would also include any servants he may have had in that house. "Thou shalt be saved in thy house." Now, he could not believe for his house. They would have to believe. But you believe and you can be saved, and this salvation can extend beyond you to your house. Well, that's not all it says. You know, a lot of preachers will preach that, and they think, well, we're saved by faith only. And here, what did Paul say? "Believe on the Lord Jesus Christ, and thou shalt be saved." And they act like everything stopped right there, and that was the end of the story. Look what it says. Let's keep reading. My father-in-law, Clifford Real, he used to say, "One of these days I'm going to preach a sermon called The Rest of the Verse." And this would be a good time, good passage to include in that. What else does it say? It says, "They spake unto him the word of the Lord and all that was in his house." Now, they needed to believe, but what was he to believe? He had to hear something to believe. And so they spoke to him, no doubt telling him about Jesus, why he is the Christ, what kind of salvation he has to offer, and no doubt telling them what they must do to be saved. And it's not just the jailer now, his house. I want you to watch his house. They're talking to those in his house about the word of the Lord. Now, and, see the and, he keeps going. "And he took them the same hour of the night and washed their stripes." By then, the wounds would have grown cold, wouldn't they? You know how it feels to get some kind of cut, some kind of wound, and while it is warm, on a fresh wound, you can pretty well wash it. Once it grows cold, that water can sting like alcohol, can't it? Well, I imagine that was quite a tender thing, and that jailer, no doubt, was being very gently trying to help them. And those stripes, to heal properly, they needed washing. And that must have stung Paul and Silas as he was doing this, but that needed to be tended to. That's quite a difference than thrusting them into the inner prison. This jailer's acting very differently toward them now and taking tender care of Paul and Silas. But and it doesn't stop there. And was baptized, he and all his straightway. They all heard. They all believed. And they were all baptized. And they didn't put it off. The same hour of the night. Straightway. They didn't wait till baptism Sunday comes around in 2 or 3 months. You know, we'll have baptism Sunday. They didn't wait for something like that. Now was the time. Now, we extend the invitation at every service, but you don't have to wait until an invitation is extended. I've had people come through the door and says, I want to be baptized tonight. I said, well, don't wait till the invitation. We'll begin service tonight with your baptism and baptize them first. And if someone's in a study, any hour of the night, if it's after midnight, someone wants to be baptized, you know, we'd drop everything. We'd get up in the night and get dressed. Well, meet me down at the building, or I'll go down there. You got a pool or a creek or something? We'll baptize you that same hour of the night. Do it straightway. It's not something you want to delay and put off. So, when he brought them into his house, he set meat before them, believing in God with all his house. All his house believed. Why do I keep talking about his house? Here's the reason. This is a passage that people have turned to talk about infant baptism. Here's how it goes. The jailer and his house. Well, his house probably had infants in there. And so when they baptized all his house, they must have baptized his infants, his children, with him. You know, you don't read anything about children in this house. But you do read that all that were in that house heard and believed and were baptized. And so, at any age, that could not have been an infant. An infant wouldn't have understood what you were saying and wouldn't have had the capacity, the mental capacity to believe. But all that were in his house, they heard and they believed and they were baptized. And then after that, they rejoiced. Look where the rejoicing comes in. The rejoicing comes in following the baptism. It's a joyous thing. An initiation has taken place. A state has changed. Instead of now being a child of the devil, you're a child of God, and there's reason to rejoice following a baptism. Now, when it was day, the magistrates sent the sergeant saying, let those men go. They're the ones that had condemned them and beaten them and had them imprisoned, and now they say, let them go. They got enough. Just let them go. Sort of treating them just like they don't count. Well, the keeper of the prison came in and told Paul, the magistrates is sent to let you go. Now therefore depart and go in peace. I mean, the jailer thought, well, they're going to let him go. That sounds good. But not Paul. Paul said, they have beaten us openly, uncondemned, that is without a trial, being Romans. Let me tell you about Philippi. There was a civil war in Rome between the friends of Julius and the men that had assassinated Julius that were in the Roman Senate. The assassins were trying to uphold the idea of a Roman republic. Rome ruled by a Senate. But the friends of Julius were saying, no, we're past that. This Senate is not working now. Instead of a republic, we need an emperor. And so it was really a fight over the government of Rome. Would it be an empire ruled by an emperor, or would it be ruled by this Senate? And they met on the plains before Philippi. And the city of Philippi sided with the living friends of Caesar. And they defeated Brutus and the assassins. And to reward the Philippi, it was declared to be a Roman colony. In other words, it's like a little piece of Rome, apart from Rome, but it's like little Rome out here. You've got all the privileges and honors of being just like you're in Rome. You're part of Rome now, a Roman colony. And they took great pride in that status. And yet they had beaten two Romans, Paul and Silas, Roman citizens, against the law. They had beaten them openly and sent them to prison without a trial. Now, the church was brand new in Philippi. Paul wanted that church to have some respect by those magistrates. Maybe that's why Paul decided, no, I'm not going to let them do us this way. If they'll do me this way, they'll do my brethren this way. I'm going to put a little fear into them. Said, no, we're not going to go out like this. You gotta come release us, because you have beaten us as Romans and uncondemned. They've cast us in the prison. Now do they thrust us out privately? No, nay, barely. Like we might say, no way, nay, barely. But let them come in themselves and fetch us out. Well, that shook them up. The sergeants told these words to the magistrates. They feared. And when they heard that they were Romans, and they came and besought them. Now it's gone from the sergeants to the magistrates. And those magistrates came, brought them out, and desired them to depart out of the city. Well, they're being real nice about it now. And Paul didn't immediately leave. They went out of the prison. Now watch what they did. They entered into the house of Lydia. When they had seen the brethren, they comforted them and departed. Okay, three things here. First, Lydia had hosted Paul and Silas in the city, and now the brethren had gathered at Lydia's house with Paul and Silas in prison. I bet they were praying for them the way that they had prayed for Paul when he was in Jerusalem. It doesn't mention that, but I bet that's what they were doing. Well, he goes to their house. Now, if I knew a couple of preachers that had been beaten and mistreated and spent the night in a prison in stocks, and then they showed up at my house, well, I would want to comfort them. I would want to do things to help them and comfort them and help them feel better about their situation. But here, as I read this, it sounds like Paul and Silas were comforting the brethren. Isn't that interesting? And not only that, they called them brethren. There's not many Jews in Philippi. They didn't even have a synagogue. These are Gentiles that have become Christians, and now there's a new brotherhood that consists of the followers of Christ. There's a brotherhood among Jews. There's a brotherhood among different sects, but now here's the brotherhood of Christ, and they're comforting their brethren. And then they departed. Now this is fascinating to me too. They passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia and came to Thessalonica, where there was a synagogue of the Jews. That's about 30 miles apiece. Now, I had the exact numbers, but I'm not going to try to remember, 32, 28, something like that. But about 30 miles apiece. After they had been beaten and spent a night in a prison in stocks, then after a little respite at Lydia's house, they got up and walked 90 miles. I just think that's astounding how they did that. And about 30 miles, that's about how far you'd go in a day. That go those Roman roads, you cover about 30 miles. That's a good day's walk. And so they walked about 30 miles to Amphipolis, about 30 miles to Apollonia, about 30 miles to Thessalonica. I think that last one's probably 35 to 38 miles, that distance. That's a good long walk for a day, isn't it? And so in that trip, that's why I mentioned these places. These would be the stopovers, and they're going along the Ignatian Way. There's the map. Let me get a little closer look at that part. There we are. It's a little blurry because I've zoomed in, but you see Neapolis over there? I think that's Neapolis and Philippi. And then how they come down to, I think that's Thessalonica right there. And the two cities in between. This is the highway they're walking on. It's one of the roads that Caesar Augustus had built, the Ignatian Way, going across all the way, almost, you cross the Adriatic Sea, coming off of Rome, cross the Adriatic Sea, and then this Roman road built to transport his army to Byzantium if they want to make a good, quick journey like that across the other side. That most of that road is still there. It's part of it's been paved over, part of it's not in use, part of it may be lost, but you can travel most of that road, and here's what you'll be traveling. Look at that. Those Roman road engineers, and you can go walk in the steps of Paul along the Ignatian Way, the Via Ignatia, they call it. And so I think that's interesting to see how they would walk across. It's kind of like taking the interstate today. You know, that's why our interstates were built after World War II. Eisenhower says, look, if we're going to need to transport troops rapidly around the country, we need a system of roads where we can do that. And he had the interstates built with the idea that when the military is not using them, the civilians can use it for their transportation. That's really how the idea of our interstate system came about. And it's sort of when Eisenhower, he may got the idea from Caesar Augustus, rapid transport of our troops. So when you see the National Guard going up and down the interstate, remember, it's their interstate. We're the ones using it, but it's their interstate. That's what that's for. Now, there was a synagogue of the Jews there. There wasn't one in Philippi. So Paul would go to the synagogues to preach. Paul, as his manner was, went unto them 3 Sabbath days, reasoned with them out of the Scriptures. That's for 3 Saturdays, for 3 Sabbaths. Now, he was there longer than that. But those first 3 Sabbaths, he's reasoning with them in their synagogues out of the Scriptures. I want you to notice these words that describe Paul's preaching. He reasoned, he opened, he alleged. What's he doing? He's appealing to their minds. He didn't spend 3 days trying to whoop them up into some kind of religious fervor to get them all excited and emotional and respond that way where they jump up over the pews and waller in the sawdust and howl like dogs. He wasn't doing that. He's appealing to their intelligence and using rational thought to reach their minds. And he's using their own scriptures to do it. Well, what's he teaching this way? Well, he's teaching 3 things. 3 things. 2 of them mentioned here, and 1 of them implied a little later, but 2 of them here. One is, Christ must needs have suffered and risen again from the dead. He probably turned to Isaiah. Look at Isaiah 53. And so we go over there. Now look what it says. He's going to suffer. It talks about his resurrection. He's teaching them. That's what the Old Testament said would happen. Now, Jesus did that. And so he is the Christ. That's number 2. That the Christ, the Messiah, must suffer and rise from the dead. Number 2, Jesus is the Christ. I'll get to number 3 in just a minute. Well, some of them believed. They all didn't. but some of them believed. And that means some of the Jews, also some of the Greeks, and some of the chief women. So Paul had quite an impact there in Philippi. He's later going to write to the Thessalonians how they turned from idols to serve the living God. Well, that would be the Greeks that had done that. The Jews were not worshiping idols, but a great number of the Greeks were hearing this, and they were becoming Christians. Well, the Jews which believed not moved with envy. Envy, isn't that a terrible thing to motivate you? Envy. And what they did, they found certain lewd fellows of the baser sort. You know, we've got them today, don't we? They're out there. You can find them. There's always seems to be those that really have no care for any holy, righteous, civil thing. They're always up for causing trouble. You ain't want a riot? Boy, there've been riots you've seen on TV. People rioting, and the reporter said, "What are you rioting about?" Said, "Well, I don't know, but we're just rioting, you know." Certain lewd fellows of the baser sort, and they gathered a company and set all the city in an uproar, assaulted the house of Jason. I think this is the only place we read about Jason. He had housed Paul and Silas. So they're evidently going into his house looking for him. They don't find him, but they do bring him out. They drew Jason and certain of the brethren to the rulers of the city and said, "These men have turned the world upside down." What they're doing, they're turning the world right side up. But they're saying they're turning the world upside down. And they've come hither also. When Jason hath received, these do contrary to the decrees of Caesar. Well, they weren't doing anything contrary to the decrees of Caesar, but here's what they were teaching. Here's number 3. 1, that Christ would suffer and rise from the grave. 2, that Jesus was the Christ. But look at number 3. There's another king, one Jesus. Paul was evidently preaching something about the king and his kingdom. He's teaching them about Christ and his church and explaining to them the spiritual kingdom. Well, they only took a piece of that and used it to falsely accuse. Well, they troubled the people and the rulers of the city when they heard these things. So when they took security of Jason and of the other men, they let them go, taking security. They had to post some kind of bond. And for what it's worth, the commentators say what they did, they had Jason and the brethren said, "Okay, you post bond, and then you be the ones to make sure Paul and Silas don't cause any more trouble." Of course, if there was more trouble, they would have to forfeit their bond. That's what the commentators think that's significant about they taking security, and that makes sense. That would fit this situation, wouldn't it? So, the brethren immediately sent Paul and Silas by night unto Berea. Night travel was not a common thing, but they got to get them out of their city. And they came thither, they went into the synagogue of the Jews. That's the 25 verses we'll cover tonight. Let's look at what we've seen now. People, places, events, and things. People, these are the ones named. Paul, Silas, and I put persons on here. God, Jesus Christ, Lydia, Jason, Caesar. These are the ones specifically identified. You can mention the magistrates and the jailer and the sergeants and those others in there as well. But these are the ones with the proper names mentioned in this part of Paul's journeys. Now the places, Philippi was not named in these verses, but we know that's where he was. It's this started. It was a Philippian jailer. He was in Philippi. But then there's Amphipolis, Apollonia, Thessalonica, and now we're over to Berea. That's about a 2 days journey from Thessalonica to Berea, if I remember that correctly. A little bit further along the Ignatian Way, and they begin to turn south. The events, the baptism of the jailer, and the preaching in Thessalonica. But let's look at some things learned. I've got a list of things that's of some teachings for us out of this. Number 1, the jailer heard, believed, repented, and was baptized. Well, that's the pattern. That's what we keep seeing in the book of Acts, and that's how we know what to do. Second, his house heard, believed, and was baptized. There weren't infants hearing and believing and being baptized. His house was. It wasn't just the jailer. His house now the jailer had what we would call a Christian home, didn't he? All right. They were baptized straightway. This wasn't something you put off. I'll just wait and do this later. I'll wait till the convenient season. Don't do that. Immediately. Now, I know what to do, and I'm not going to put it off. Straightway, same hour of the night. It says they rejoiced after their baptism. That's when you read about the rejoicing. Kind of reminds me of the eunuch, remember, the Ethiopian, who went on his way rejoicing. When? After the baptism. There's great joy in this, but it follows the baptism. Paul is preaching. He reasoned. He opened. He alleged from the Scriptures. That's what you want your preacher to do, isn't it? You want your preacher to have you open your Bibles and follow his thoughts, his reasoning. See what he proposes. See how he makes his proof. Does it make sense? Can you follow? Is it reasonable? Is it rational? Is it logical? As you read the Scriptures and hear that explanation, that's how you want a preacher to preach, right there. And then, here's what Paul preached, the three things. Number one, the Scriptures teach us that the Christ would suffer and rise from the dead. Number two, Jesus is that promised Christ. And number three, Jesus is the promised King. That's the gist of Paul's preaching in the book of Acts. Are you ready to be baptized? Straightway? Now? It's not for delay. You can come forward and do like that jailer did as we stand and sing the invitation song.